You know, Yehudi, I can't imagine any music for violin and piano, or violin and harpsichord, or violin and keyboard, whatever it may be, that is less conditioned by the nature of the instruments than this Bach sonata, or than any of the Bach sonatas for that matter. They could be played by flute solo with set of virginals. They could be trio of clarinets.
Pure music, as it were.
Absolutely.
We have seen Bach arranged for every kind of orchestration, whistled and piped, and swung and everything.
I think the proof of its purity is the fact that I kept playing your part at rehearsal all the time. You know?
I know, it's quite incredible music that way, and yet, of course, Bach was such a good instrumentalist that whatever he did write for the violin is eminently playable.
It lies marvelously well under the fingers at all times, yes, indeed. There's never a sense of traversing the instrument beyond its...
Is that true of the very complicated fugues, that, the C major fugue, for instance, for violin alone, which only a violinist could really write?
You know, that's curious because since we're going to play in a few minutes the Phantasy of Arnold Schoenberg, there's a rather interesting contrast because Schoenberg is a man who one obviously feels has great interest in instruments per se. His whole lineage from Mahler, Strauss, Wagner, what have you, was a lineage of cultivating the color of instruments. And the Phantasy is full of all sorts of, I suppose, I don't know, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, genuinely violinistic things. He exploits harmonics on the instrument. And so
yes, and yet it's curiously clumsy in another way. And it's pure music too, in a different sense, but very akin to what you were saying of Bach, because as far as the notes themselves are concerned, they are dictated more by the sequence of notes than they are by the instrument for which they're written.
By the 12-tone series as such. I suppose that's true. There's some very odd, arbitrary formations in the last works of Schoenberg, and this is one of the very last, of course. He wrote it, I think, about 2 years before he died, 2 or 3 years before. You know, one of the curious things about this piece, as you mentioned the other day when we were rehearsing it, I think, is that it was conceived as a solo violin line. It's entirely monodic, and all of the piano comments were interpolated later, which is probably why I play on the cracks all the time. And you have all the lines, as Jean Kerr says.
But it's curious how this kind of music evolved into the pointilliste music with so many
of the young
pauses.
Yes, the music of great silence.
And I've just thought of this. It's a theory that may not hold water at all. But the fact that the sound as such is more or less always the same. I mean by that there isn't great contrast, intervallic contrast, between dissonance and consonance, as it were. That is by the board. We don't speak of that anymore.
Yes.
So the only contrast there could be is between sound and no sound. And that's probably why there's so many pauses.
Could it also be possibly why there are so many dynamic... No, I don't think it's facetious at all. It's a very legitimate complaint. But could it also be why there are so many dynamic extremes in the piece, so many sforzando pianos and sudden fortissimos and pianissimos and this kind of thing?
Perhaps. That's because harmonically there isn't enough contrast in this kind of music, so that the other contrasts of location of notes, octaves apart, in great distances and great jumps and so on, and as you say, pauses. But
putting all your cards on the table, Yehudi, you really don't like the Schoenberg, do you?
Well, Glenn, I was very anxious to take you up on the invitation to play it, because I admire you and know that you know more about Schoenberg and have a genuine understanding of Schoenberg, perhaps than anyone else. And I'm always interested in learning about something through the eyes of someone who understands it and loves it. Because I've always had the motto in my life that anyone who liked something knew more about it than one who didn't.
But if you could put it into one or two basic complaints, other than the registrational ones and the fact that it doesn't quite fit the instrument, what is your real anxiety about this piece? I mean, what basically disturbs you most of it?
Well, the fact that there is a curious discrepancy between the gesture and the words. It's as if you had taken the words apart of say, a play of Hamlet of Shakespeare, and merely strung together an arbitrary sequence of syllables which had no meaning as such. But the rhythm and the gesture of the play were copied absolutely, so that the person who knew the play would recognize the places where the love scene takes place and where the ghost turns up and so on.
It's a marvelous analogy.
And therefore, that bothers me a little bit. There is a pure waltz, and the only way it gets away with being a waltz is that it becomes naturally a caricature of a waltz. It's a parody of a waltz.
But on the other hand, surely what makes it a caricature of a waltz is the fact that the whole piece is not a collection of waltzes. On the contrary, the waltz scene as such, if one can call it that, stands out because it is centered between the most, what can one say, Old Testament pronouncements. I mean, this is Schoenberg, much of the time, of the angriest
Well, of course, you
kind.
may be perfectly right. I mean, we live in a world of symbols, which we take for granted. We don't know ourselves if a symbol has an intrinsic merit in terms of its actual meaning as such. We do know, however, that there are certain things that are hot and others that are cold, and some that are sharp and others that are gentle. We know that the major chord is generally happy and that the minor chord is
not
depressing.
in this vocabulary.
But not in this book. And of course, to that extent, it disturbs all our the symbols that we take for granted. And to that extent, it may be a healthy thing to disrupt all our known crutches. But I think that it's a negative service in that it has cleared the board for something, shall we say, which had to happen at the end of a certain of the Romantic period, and the overlading of orchestration and thickening of everything. But I think that the service is a negative one. I personally cannot believe that this music stands on its own.
Nevertheless, I detect in what you say the fact that you're genuinely interested in what's coming out of this music.
Oh, definitely.
You are not
and I think
against what's happening because of
I'm
Schoenberg.
not, and I have an open mind, and I can play it, thanks to you, with a certain conviction. But I feel that the conviction I bring it is the conviction of the gesture and not of the notes.